Your food is rustic, Alina, so very simple. Amanda's voice, smooth and sharp like polished glass, cut through the noise of the bustling kitchen. I need elegance for this banquet. Sophistication. For 40 years, I had poured my soul into my cooking. My hands, now wrinkled and stained with the memory of 1,000 spices, had fed my son Leo from the time he was a boy with scraped knees to the man in the tailored suit who now stood silently beside his wife. My food was a story of our family, the taste of a home we left behind, the sacrifice I made so he could have this life, this beautiful house, this ambitious wife, and in her eyes that story was worth nothing more than a dismissive wave of her perfectly manicured hand. All those years of packing his lunches, of stirring the pot after a 12-hour shift, cleaning other people's houses, of stretching every dollar to buy the fresh cilantro and ripe tomatoes he loved. All of it reduced to simple. A cold fury, slow and deep like a river, began to move inside me. This wasn't about my cooking, it was about me. I was the simple ingredient she wanted to remove from her perfect, sophisticated recipe for success. I watched her turn to the caterer, a man with a stiff white coat and an even stiffer smile, and point to a tray of my empanadas, and please, get rid of these. The last thing I need are my guests smelling of fried dough and ethnicity. The caterer nodded and began to move my food, my history, towards the trash can. That was the moment the world stopped. A deafening silence filled my ears, and the image of my life's work being thrown away like garbage burned itself into my mind. My son, my Leo, just stood there, his gaze fixed on the floor, a stranger in his own mother's story. How did we get here? How did the boy who once begged for my era's canpalo become the man who stood by silently as his wife threw my heart in the trash? My mind drifted back, away from the stainless steel and the cold judgment of that kitchen, back to a time when things weren't so simple. I remembered arriving in this country with nothing but a worn-out suitcase and a picture of my mother. Leo was just a baby, his tiny hand clutching my finger as we stepped into a world that felt impossibly big and loud. I learned English by reading children's books to him at night after my shifts. I worked until my bones ached, my hands raw, scrubbing floors and washing dishes so he could have tutors, so he could go to college, so he would never have to feel the sting of being looked down upon. I never wanted him to be seen as simple. When he brought Amanda home, I saw the hunger in her eyes, not for food, but for something more. She was beautiful, educated, and came from a world of country clubs and summer homes that I only ever saw from the outside, with a mop in my hand. I gave them my life savings for the down payment on this house. I thought I was giving my son a foundation, but I was just buying a ticket for a woman who would one day decide I wasn't good enough to attend the party. The signs were there. The way she'd gently correct my accent, the way she'd replace the colorful tapestries from my village with sterile gray art. The way she called me Alina instead of Mama and the final cut, just last week when I overheard her on the phone with one of her friends. Yes, of course, Leo's mother will be here, she'd said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. We have to let her feel useful in the kitchen. It's all she really knows. After all, it smelled of old fabric and, faintly, of the cumin and paprika I used in my cooking. It smelled of me. Amanda's words, "it's all she really knows," weren't just an insult. They were a chisel, methodically prying loose the very foundations of my life. Each memory I had clung to, each cherished moment of struggle and sacrifice, now felt tainted, reinterpreted through her condescending lens. Had Leo heard her on the phone that day, he must have been in the next room, in his home office, surrounded by the expensive, silent electronics his salary afforded. Did he hear the dismissal in his wife's voice and simply let it wash over him, a minor, inconvenient noise? The thought was a colder, deeper cut than Amanda's words could ever be. I saw his face from earlier that evening, a placid mask of pleasantry. He had accepted the container of *sarmali*. I'd spent all afternoon rolling, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Thanks, Mamak. You shouldn't have." But he didn't say, "Stay." He didn't say, "Eat." with us. He was a bystander in the slow erasure of his own mother. I had scrubbed the floors of strangers so his hands could remain soft. Held together with cheap thread the seams of my uniforms so he could wear tailored suits, and in doing so, I had sewn my own lips shut. I had never told him of the humiliations, the times a foreman had called me stupid, the times I'd gone hungry to ensure he had a second helping of meat. I wanted his world to be clean and bright, free of the grime I waded through. But in shielding him, I had made myself a stranger to him. He saw the simple, accented woman, not the titan of will who had moved mountains for him. The city lights outside my window blurred, smearing into streaks of gold and white. I wasn't crying for the insult anymore. I was mourning the death of my own narrative. My entire identity had been built around being Leo's mother, the immigrant who made good. And now, that identity was a ruin. I had poured the concrete of my life into the foundation of his consciation, and he was now living in a house that denied I had ever existed, that the soil beneath it was my own pulverized bones. A raw, guttural sound escaped my throat, startling in the silence. It was a noise of pure, undiluted grief. This was rock bottom, yes, but it wasn't a soft landing. It was the hard, cold floor of a truth I could no longer avoid. I had become invisible to my own son. My love had been a transaction I hadn't known I was making, and I was left with nothing but the receipt. I sat there for hours, the night deepening around me. The numbness began to recede, replaced by a slow, simmering heat in the pit of my stomach. It was a familiar feeling, one I hadn't felt in decades. It was the same fire that had kept me warm on my first, terrifying night in this country, in a roach-infested studio with a baby who depended on me for everything. It was the fire of survival. Amanda thought the kitchen was all I knew. She was wrong. The kitchen was where I fought my battles. It was where I learned a new language from the pages of Goodnight Moon *, my voice a hoarse whisper after a double shift. It was where I calculated bills and budgets over a pot of boiling potatoes. It was my command center, my sanctuary, the place where I turned raw, simple ingredients into something sustaining and beautiful. She saw a servant's quarters. I saw a forge. A memory, sharp and clear-cut through the fog of my self-pity. My own mother, her hands gnarled from a lifetime in the fields, teaching me to make the very same serum asterisk. She hadn't taught me with written recipes, but with stories. She'd wrap the cabbage leaves, her fingers swift and sure, and tell me about the winter the harvest failed, and how her mother had stretched a single chicken to feed 10 people for a week. Food is not just food, Alina, she'd said, her dark eyes holding mine. It is memory, it is strength, it is love that you can hold in your hands. Amanda had revealed her hand, and in doing so, she had handed me a weapon. She thought my world was small, confined to a stove and a sink. But my world was built on a scale of sacrifice she could never comprehend. I finally stood up, my joints protesting. I walked to the small bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. The woman in the mirror had eyes red-rimmed from tears, but there was a new, hard light in them. A resolve. The passive ghost was receding. The fighter was waking up. Amanda wanted a simple woman who only knew her place in the kitchen. Fine, let her think that, but I was no longer cooking for their approval. I was no longer feeding a son who had forgotten the taste of his own history. If the kitchen was the only territory they acknowledged as mine, then it was from that kitchen that I would wage my war. It was all I really knew, she said. She had no idea what I was capable of. The next morning, while dusting a small wooden box my grandmother had given me, my fingers brushed against a tiny, sealed clay pot tucked in the corner. It was heavy for its size. I opened it, and the sharp, earthy scent instantly transported me back to my grandmother's garden in our village, the air thick with the perfume of cilantro and damp soil. Inside was a handful of tiny, dried, jet-black peppers, no larger than mouse droppings. They looked innocuous, almost dull. But my pulse quickened. She called it pimienta de la verdad, the pepper of truth. It wasn't for eating. It was a catalyst, an herb that, when prepared correctly, could strip away all pretense and force the unvarnished truth from anyone who consumed it. My secret knowledge, the ethnobotany my grandmother taught me, wasn't just about healing herbs, it was also about these special ones. Be careful with this one, Elena, Abuela had warned, her gnarled finger pointing at the unassuming plant with its tiny, dark fruit. It does not create lies, it only removes the walls people build to hide behind. Sometimes, what is behind those walls is uglier than any lie. Asterisk, it's all she really knows. Asterisk, the hard light I'd seen in my own eyes the night before seemed to glint off the dark, shriveled peppers. A weapon. She had handed me a weapon, and now I was holding another one. The plan didn't form so much as it simply arrived fully realized, as if it had been waiting in the wings of my mind for this exact moment. It was audacious, it was dangerous, and it was perfect. The annual Lawson Foundation Gala was in 3 days. It was the social event of David and Amanda's calendar, a glittering parade of philanthropy and pretension held at the Museum of Modern Art. Every year, I prepared the canapes for their pre-gala cocktail hour, an intimate gathering of their closest, most influential friends. Amanda took immense pride in these bites, presenting them as her own culinary genius. David would beam, so proud of his sophisticated, talented wife. I had always seethed in silence, my contributions reduced to a well-kept secret. Another brick in the wall of my invisibility. This year would be different. I would make my albondigas in a spicy tomato sauce, the recipe my grandmother taught me, the one Amanda had so casually dismissed as a party favor. But this time, I would make a special, smaller batch for Amanda and David. And in their sauce, I would infuse a single, finely ground pimienta de la. I wasn't a vengeful person by nature, but the image of Amanda laughing with her friends, my albondigas, my mother's stretched chicken, my grandmother's clever hands being treated as a trivial amusement had scorched something gentle inside me. This wasn't just about an insult, this was about reclamation. If the kitchen was my territory, then I would use its language to speak a truth they had all been too comfortable to ignore. The next 2 days were a study in controlled frenzy. I moved through my chores with a serene detachment that seemed to please Amanda. She saw the placid ghost, the efficient housekeeper. She didn't see the strategist, the alchemist measuring her revenge not in poison, but in truth. In the quiet of the night, I ground one of the tiny black peppers into an impossibly fine powder using the marble mortar and pestle my grandmother had left me. The scent was intense, peppery and ancient, with an acrid undertone that made my eyes water. This was the catalyst. It had to be handled with care, its potency balanced by the richness of the sauce. The day of the gala, the kitchen was my battlefield. I prepared the main batch of albondigas for the guests, the aroma of garlic, cumin, and oregano filling the air. Then, in a separate, smaller saucepan, I started the special sauce. I sautéed onions until they were translucent, added the crushed tomatoes, the spices. My hands were steady as I stirred in the minuscule amount of black powder. It dissolved instantly, leaving no trace, its sharp scent disappearing into the rich, red tapestry of the sauce. I felt a thrill of fear, cold and sharp. There was no going back. I arranged the platters. The guest-seen albondigas were on a large, beautiful ceramic dish. The special ones, for my son and his wife, were on a smaller, more elegant silver tray, placed right at their end of the table. A subtle distinction, a targeted strike. When the guests arrived, I became the ghost again, refilling drinks, collecting empty glasses. I watched as Amanda, resplendent in a sapphire blue gown, gestured to the spread. "Oh, just a little something I whipped up," she demurred, picking up one of the regular albondigas. My eyes were fixed on David. My son. He looked handsome and strained, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. He moved to the silver platter and speared one of the special meatballs. He ate it in one bite, nodding absently. A moment later, Amanda joined him, taking one for herself. Os convidados continuavam a circular pelo salão, entretidos e alheios ao veneno que já se infiltrava em seus organismos. O Piper da verdade não era uma toxina de ação rápida, mas um pavio de queima lenta, à espera da faísca certa. And then it happened. David, standing near the fireplace, was asked by an older gentleman, Mr. Henderson, about a recent business acquisition. It was a routine question, one David had answered with polished corporate speak a dozen times before. This time, he looked at Mr. Henderson, and his face seemed to slacken. The carefully constructed mask of the poised executive slipped. The acquisition, David said, his voice a decibel too loud. It's a disaster, frankly. We overpaid by $30 million. The board is furious, but I have to stand there and pretend it was a strategic math. I lie awake at night wondering if I'm going to be ousted by Christmas. Modest, he said, the word dripping with a newfound, brutal honesty. There's no room for modesty in this charade, Amanda. Just like there's no truth in this entire house, not even in the food we eat. The woman who had wept in the car last night was gone, washed away by the quiet certainty that my simple cooking would be the perfect vessel for a very sophisticated lesson in respect. Amanda saw me as a relic to be hidden away, but she had underestimated the roots that ran deeper than she could ever imagine. I would not be erased. The plan was a seed, and it grew with a terrifying, beautiful speed. I spent the morning in the garden, my fingers brushing the soil, grounding myself in the one thing this house could never fake. The pepper of truth, pimenta da verdade, was my secret weapon, nurtured in a secluded corner behind the rampant lavender. Getting into the kitchen was the first challenge. Maria, the full-time chef, was a whirlwind of controlled panic. Minha nossa. Asterisk, the beef tenderloin, it is not room temperature. And the hollandaise, it is separating, she cried to the universe at large. Let me help, I said, my voice calm, a still pond in her storm. I can handle the appetizers. The arancini, the meatballs. Simple things. Amanda is very specific. With the edge of a knife, I scraped them, creating a fine, potent dust. It smelled of nothing but earth and a faint, smoky bitterness. I sprinkled the dust over the platter, tossing the golden brown spheres gently to coat them. It was a subtle garnish, a whisper of something rustic and authentic. To anyone else, it was a chef's touch. To me, it was the laying of a trap. The guests arrived in a wave of perfumes and polished small talk. I stayed in the background, a ghost in my own family's home, refilling water glasses and clearing empty champagne flutes. I watched David and Amanda perform their duet of success. His hand on the small of her back, her laugh a little too bright, a little too frequent. They were beautiful mannequins in a beautifully staged window display. Then, the moment of truth. David, ever the gracious host, sampled a meatball from the platter I strategically held near him. He ate it in one bite, nodding absently. A moment later, Amanda joined him, taking one for herself. I held my breath. Nothing happened immediately. They laughed, they chatted, they moved through the room. The pepper of truth was not a fast-acting toxin. It was a slow-burning fuse, waiting for the right spark. The guests raved about the food. Amanda, you've outdone yourself. A silver-haired man boomed. The moment of truth arrived. Standing near the fireplace, David found himself engaged by the older gentleman, Mr. Henderson, who inquired about a recent business acquisition. This time, he looked at Mr. Henderson, and his face seemed to sicken. The carefully constructed mask of the poised executive slipped. The acquisition, David said, his voice a decibel too loud. It's a disaster, frankly. We overpaid by $30 million. The board is furious, but I have to stand there and pretend it was a strategic I lie awake at night wondering if I'm going to be ousted by Christmas. Modest, he said, the word dripping with a newfound, brutal honesty. There's no room for modesty in this charade, Amanda. Just like there's no truth in this entire house, not even in the food we eat. Amanda's brittle smile shattered completely, replaced by a look of pure, undiluted panic. David, she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You're not feeling well. The piece is so audacious. We bought it from a catalog, a corporate art catalog. It was on sale." David said the real one was a pretentious waste of money, and he was probably right. David was now staring into his whiskey glass as if it contained all the answers to his crumbling life. The perfect portrait of the power couple was cracking, and through the fractures, the ugly, real colors were bleeding out. They were no longer untouchable. They were just a man and a woman trapped in a beautiful lie that was now, bite by bite, collapsing around them. And the simple cousin from the old country, was the architect of it all. I took a slow, deep breath. The scent of roasted meat and expensive perfume now mingled with the faint, acrid smell of burning facades. The banquet was finally getting interesting. I began my work not with anger, but with precision. My secret was not just the pepper, but the knowledge of how to use it without a trace. It needed to be ground into an undetectable powder and activated by a specific acidic ingredient. I started to help Amanda with her banquet planning. I listened intently to her menu discussions with the caterer, making notes of the sauces, the dressings, the cocktails, under the guise of a frail old woman trying to be useful. I was a scientist gathering data for my experiment, looking for the perfect medium to deliver the truth. The caterer, a man named Felipe, with a meticulously trimmed beard and the weary eyes of someone who has seen too many rich people's tantrums, presented the finalized menu. I sat in a corner of the vast, sunlit kitchen, my hands busy with the pretense of darning a tablecloth, my ears straining to catch every syllable. "We will begin," Felipe declared, with an amuse-bouche of tuna tartare in a sesame ginger cone. Then, a pear and gorgonzola soup, chilled. For the main, a choice of beef Wellington with a red wine demi-glace, or a truffle-infused risotto for our vegetarian guests. And to finish, a dark chocolate torte with a raspberry cream. The day of the banquet arrived in a flurry of controlled chaos. The house, usually a museum of cold perfection, was invaded by an army of staff. Florists arranged towering scentless blossoms, and a string quartet tuned their instruments in the grand hall. I moved through it all like a ghost, a silent, nodding specter in a borrowed black dress, my presence so insignificant it was practically invisible. My moment came during the pre-dinner cacophony, when the kitchen was a symphony of shouted orders and clanging pans, and the focus was on getting the first course out. Felipe was barking at a sous chef about the temperature of the soup. Amanda was having a minor meltdown over the placement of the name cards. David was already on his third scotch, holding court in the living room. I slipped into the pantry, a walk-in closet of organized abundance, and retrieved the small wax paper envelope from the deep pocket of my apron. Inside was my alchemy. The dried, desiccated Piper Veritas ground to a dust so fine it was like gray pollen. It had taken me weeks back home, using a mortar and pestle worn smooth by generations, to achieve such a consistency. My hands did not shake. My breath was even. This was not vengeance. It was a correction. A recalibration of the universe. They had built their kingdom on the bones of my family's happiness, and it was only right that the foundation should be made to speak. I emerged from the pantry, clutching a sprig of parsley I had grabbed as an excuse. The large silver boat of red wine demi-glace sat on the central counter, waiting to be ladled. It was the color of old blood, shimmering under the halogen lights. For a moment, I was not in that stainless steel kitchen. I was in my mother's kitchen, the air thick with the smell of baking bread and herbs. The sound of her laughter a constant, warm melody. The memory was a sharp, physical pain, a ghost limb I could still feel. Then it passed. I shuffled towards the counter, mumbling about the parsley garnish. As I passed the boat of sauce, my hip, seemingly by accident, bumped a stack of clean-tasting spoons. They clattered to the floor. The nearest line cook, a young man with a face full of concentration, cursed under his breath and bent to retrieve them. It was the work of a second. My hand, shielded by my body, and the fall of the spoons hovered over the demi-glace. A quick, deft flick of the wrist, and the powder was gone, dissolving into the hot, acidic liquid without a trace, without a scent. It was done. I helped the flustered cook pick up the spoons, mumbling apologies in my broken English. He waved me off, annoyed. I was just the clumsy old aunt, an obstacle in his path to culinary perfection. I took my assigned seat at the far end of the table, a place of calculated insignificance. I watched as the soup was served, then cleared. I watched as the main course was presented with a theatrical flourish. The plates of beef Wellington were placed before David, Amanda, and their inner circle of vipers, Jeanette and her hedge fund husband. A tech billionaire with a vacant stare, a senator who wore his corruption like a cheap cologne. I watched as the server spooned the dark, gleaming demi-glace over their meat. I picked at my own risotto, my appetite gone, replaced by a cold, clinical anticipation. The first bite, then the second. I saw David take a large mouthful, washing it down with a gulp of his prized Bordeaux. I saw Amanda take a more delicate bite, her smile fixed in place. For a few minutes, nothing, just the clink of silverware, the murmur of hollow conversation, the performance of normalcy. Then, a subtle shift. The senator's wife, a woman known for her glacial composure, suddenly giggled at something inconsequential. Her husband glanced at her, startled. David's laugh at a joke from the tech billionaire seemed a decibel too loud, a little unhinged. The catalyst, however, was Jeanette. She was the key that turned the lock. When she turned to Amanda, her eyes alight with genuine admiration for that hideous, twisted sculpture, and asked her question, the chain reaction began. I saw the flicker of panic in Amanda's eyes as the practiced lie about Oslo and MoMA left her lips. I saw the internal struggle, a war between the persona she had built and the raw, unvarnished truth the pepper was pulling from her soul. The confession about the catalog, the sale, David's brutal pragmatism, didn't just land, it detonated. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound, a physical weight pressing down on the opulent table. Jeanette's recoil was a masterpiece of social horror. The stifled laugh from down the table was the first fissure in the dam. I watched, my heart, a cold, hard stone in my chest, as the carefully constructed facades began to crumble. This was the unraveling. This was the truth. Not as a noble concept, but as a wrecking ball, and it was proving to be a more effective weapon than I had imagined. David stared into his whiskey glass, as if it contained all the answers to his crumbling life. The perfect portrait of the power couple was cracking, and through the fractures, the ugly, real colors were bleeding out. They were no longer untouchable. They were just a man and a woman, trapped in a beautiful lie that was now, bite by bite, collapsing around them. And the first, the simple cousin from the old country, was the architect of it all. I took a slow, deep breath. The scent of roasted meat and expensive perfume now mingled with the faint, acrid smell of burning reputations. The banquet was finally getting interesting. The silence stretched, a taut wire humming with the unsaid. It was Jeanette who finally broke it, not with a word, but with a sound, a small, wounded exhalation, as if the air had been punched from her lungs. Her gaze, once alight with admiration, was now a wide, horrified void fixed on Amanda. The stifled laugh from down the table, which had been a solitary fissure, now spawned a dozen more. A cough that sounded suspiciously like a chuckle, a sharp, incredulous intake of breath, the nervous clink of a fork against a plate. David finally looked up from the bottom of his whiskey glass. His face, usually a mask of placid control, was a battlefield of conflicting impulses, rage, humiliation, and a desperate, calculating need to regain the upper hand. "My wife," he began, his voice a low, strained thing, "is clearly overwhelmed. The pressure of this event, the travel, she's not making sense." His words, once commands, were now just noise, bouncing off the newly erected walls of his guests' disbelief. Amanda was trembling, her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists on the linen tablecloth. The pepper's truth serum was still in her veins, warring with a lifetime of practiced deception. It was a lie, she whispered, the sound carrying in the hushed room. All of it. The catalog. It was just easier. The socialite was gone, replaced by a woman who felt personally duped. Easier than admitting you bought it from a catalog. The suspicion was a seed. Planted the first time Amanda had casually mentioned her summers in Monaco. The accent was too perfect. The anecdotes too polished, like rehearsed lines from a play. My investigation, as I thought of it in those early, lonely days, was a solitary one. I had no resources, no connections in this glittering world. All I had was a deep, gnawing certainty and the bitter taste of being made to feel small in my son's new life. It was in that state of quiet desperation that I found myself confiding in my old friend Sophia, who ran the local market where I bought my spices. The air in her shop was a familiar comfort, thick with the scent of cumin, dried chilies, and the earthy aroma of roots I knew from home. Sophia had known me since I first arrived in this country, wide-eyed and grieving my husband, struggling to find my place. She had seen me through the joy of Marco's engagement and the subtle, creeping isolation that followed. She saw the new pain in my eyes that day. As I weighed a handful of dried peppers, the very ones, now working their magic in the chicken eye. Couldn't hold it in. I told her about Amanda, about the dizzying stories that never quite added up. About the way her family was presented as old money aristocracy from some unnamed European lineage. Sophia, her hands dusted with paprika, listened without interruption. She didn't just offer the sympathetic clucks I'd received from others. Her dark, intelligent eyes narrowed in thought. When I finished, she wiped her hands on her apron and leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You're Amanda," she said, with the perfect blonde hair and the laugh that is a little too loud. "Her parents, they are the Millers. The only view is of the neighbor's identical backyard." Sophia, seeing the mix of vindication and sorrow on my face, reached across the counter and squeezed my hand. Her grip was firm, calloused from a lifetime of work. "A woman who builds her life on lies does not deserve the son of my friend," she said, her voice fierce. "You will show them, and I will help you." It was Sophia who sourced the specific, potent strain of African bird's eye chili for me. The one known not just for its heat, but for its sharp, clarifying intensity that could cut through the fog of pretense. It was she who asked Miguel for the details. The father was an accountant, the mother a part-time receptionist at a dental office. It was all so ordinary, so painfully average, and it was the bedrock of the magnificent fraud that was Amanda. And now, in this opulent dining room, the ghost of that beige tract house was the final, invisible guest at the table. David was still trying to speak, to dam the flood with lawyerly phrases, but no one was listening. They were all watching Amanda, watching the raw, unvarnished girl from Oak Creek, Glen bleed through the cracks of the socialite. I took a slow sip of water, the cool liquid doing nothing to quench the fire of satisfaction in my chest. The banquet, indeed, had become far more interesting than anyone could have possibly imagined. My first move was small, a surgical strike designed not to demolish, but to test the structural integrity of her world. Amanda was hosting a pre-banquet luncheon for her bridesmaids, a curated collection of glossy mannequins whose sole function was to reflect her own perceived glory. The air in her penthouse was thick with the cloying scent of peonies and unspoken competition. I moved through it like a ghost, offering to make my famous ceviche as an appetizer. It was a humble dish, I admitted, but a family recipe. The lie came easily, sweetened by the prospect of vengeance. In the stark, sterile whiteness of her kitchen, a place that looked more like a surgical theater than a heart of a home, I prepared my weapon. The fish was pristine, the cilantro vibrant, the limes a sharp acidic green. And then, there was my secret ingredient. From a small, unmarked vial Sophia had given me a minuscule, almost homeopathic dose of the prepared pimienta to the lime juice. The crimson paste swirled into the citrus, dissolving until it was utterly invisible, a ghost in the marinade. It wasn't about inferno, it was about truth. Sophia had explained it to me, her hands dusted with flour as she shaped dough for empanadas. This chili, she'd said, her voice a low whisper. It doesn't just burn the tongue, it burns away the nonsense. It makes the mind too honest for its own good. There was only the sound of trivial chatter discussions of honeymoon destinations in Bora Bora. Debates over the merits of calla lilies versus orchids for the centerpieces. Then, I saw it. A slight flush on the cheeks of Chloe, Amanda's most sycophantic friend, a girl whose entire personality was a mirror held up to Amanda's whims. She took a sip of her champagne, then another, a little too quickly. "It's just so fresh." "Amanda," Chloe chirped, her voice a notch too high. "A perfect choice for a light lunch." "Unlike," she trailed off, her eyes glazing over for a second, a faint sheen of sweat appearing on her upper lip. "Unlike what, darling?" Amanda asked, her smile tight, a silent command to continue the chorus of praise. Chloe blinked, the pimienta's sharp, clarifying intensity cutting through the fog of her carefully constructed filters. "Unlike your wedding dress," she blurted out, her words crisp and startlingly loud in the opulent room. A collective, sharp intake of breath from the other girls. Chloe's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror, but the chemical honesty had its grip on her. "I mean, it's stunning. Of course, Vera Wong is a goddess, but when you did the final fitting, I just thought, and don't hate me for saying this, it was just a little tight in the hips." "You must have cut out carbs too late." The other bridesmaids stared at their plates, at the ceiling, anywhere but at Amanda, whose face had frozen into a mask of such pure, undiluted fury that I thought the fine-bone china might crack from the vibration. The flush on her cheeks was no longer from the champagne. It was a blotchy, ugly red of profound humiliation. Her entire empire was built on the perception of flawless, effortless perfection, and in one unvarnished chemically induced sentence, Chloe had pointed to a crack in the foundation. Amanda's gaze slowly, inevitably, swung toward me. I met it with a look of innocent concern, tilting my head as if puzzled by Chloe's strange outburst. Inside, though, a cold, triumphant fire roared to life. It had worked. Sophia's magic, my delivery system. "We had made a liar tell the truth, Chloe," Amanda finally said, her voice dangerously soft, the sweetness now laced with shards of glass. "I think the champagne has gone to your head. Perhaps you should go lie down." As I collected the plates, my fingers brushing against the remnants of my ceviche, I saw Amanda standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, her back to me, her shoulders rigid. She was staring out at the glittering skyline. But I knew what she was really seeing. That beige house in Oak Creek Glen, the ghost at all her feasts. That small crack in Amanda's perfect facade, that single whispered truth about a dress that was a little too tight, was all the encouragement I needed. It was proof of concept. Her world wasn't made of marble. It was made of painted plaster, and I had just proven I had the tools to make it chip. The real banquet was still to come, and now I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I had the perfect recipe for the main course. The silence in the pantry was a stark contrast to the echoing chaos of the main kitchen. It was a small, windowless room lined with shelves of imported olive oils, artisanal pastas, and other untouched luxuries. Amanda, completely oblivious to the true meaning of Chloe's outburst, had dismissed the comment as mere drunken cattiness. Her arrogance, a fortress she believed to be impenetrable, was my greatest ally. It blinded her to the fact that a single, ugly truth had been vomited onto her pristine linen tablecloth. Instead of seeing a crack, she saw only a smudge to be wiped away. Her response was to become more controlling, more obsessive about the upcoming main banquet. It was as if she believed she could cement the fractured perception of her perfection by ensuring the party itself was flawless. She micromanaged the florists, terrorized the event planner, and hovered over the sommelier until the man's hands shook. And then, 2 days before the event, she delivered her masterstroke of petty humiliation. She told Leo, with a saccharine smile of faux concern, that my presence in the main kitchen was making the professional chefs uncomfortable. My rustic homespun techniques were apparently a distraction for their refined artistry. So, I was exiled, relegated to a small prep station in the walk-in pantry, tasked with the menial job of prepping garnishes and assembling canapes that required a woman's delicate touch. Leo had delivered the news with a pained expression, his loyalty to Amanda warring with some deeper, unspoken loyalty to me. "It's just for the main event, Lily," she's stressed. But inside, the cold, triumphant fire that had ignited during Chloe's humiliation blazed into an inferno. This was her fatal mistake. In her attempt to marginalize me, to put me in my place, Amanda had given me the one thing I needed above all else: privacy. The pantry became my sanctuary, my laboratory. The constant hum of the industrial refrigerator was my shield, drowning out the soft sounds of my preparations. While the main kitchen was a symphony of shouted orders and sizzling pans, my world was one of quiet, deliberate focus. I laid out my tools, a mortar and pestle I'd smuggled from home, small glass vials wrapped in a silk cloth, and the ingredients Sophia had provided. They were unassuming things: a knobby root that looked like ginger but wasn't, dried petals of a flower I didn't recognize, a powder as fine as graphite. Sophia's instructions were etched into my memory. "The truth is a delicate flavor," she had whispered, her gnarled fingers tracing the lines on my palm. "Too little, and it is lost beneath the noise of 1,000 polite lies. Too much, and it becomes a violent, messy thing that destroys the palate. You are the chef. You must balance the recipe." The centerpiece of the main course was a crown roast of lamb, a majestic, intimidating thing that Amanda had personally selected. The chefs would baste it for hours with a red wine and rosemary reduction. My contribution, assigned by a dismissive head chef, was to prepare the finishing salta Himalayan pink salt mixed with fresh herbs and lemon zest. As I ground the salt crystals in my mortar, I added the dried petals Sophia had given me. They crumbled into a dust the color of dried blood. "This," she said, "was the anchor. It would not create truth on its own, but it would make the mind receptive, softening the hard, polished shell of ego." Next, the powder. I stirred it in, watching it disappear into the pink crystals. This was the catalyst, the chemical key that would turn a suppressed thought into an irresistible utterance. The final ingredient, the knobby root, was the most potent. I grated a tiny amount less than a teaspoon and mixed it with a drop of olive oil to form a paste. This was the truth serum itself, the essence that would seek out the most tightly held secret, the most carefully constructed lie, and give it a voice. I carefully rubbed this paste onto the thick, twine-bound strings that would later be used to truss the roast. The heat of the oven would activate it, and the infused oils would seep into the meat, invisible, undetectable. My hands were steady, my breathing even. There was no guilt, no fear, only the calm certainty of a craftsman perfecting their art. I thought of Amanda standing at her floor-to-ceiling window, seeing the ghost of a beige house in a neighborhood she'd left behind. That small crack was about to become a chasm. I finished the salt, placing it in a small ceramic bowl, and set the twine aside. Through the crack in the door, I could see the controlled frenzy of the main kitchen. Amanda swept through, a vision in cream silk, her eyes critically scanning every surface. She didn't even glance toward my pantry prison. She saw a relegated, humiliated girl. She did not see an architect. The real banquet was tomorrow. The guests would arrive, dressed in their armor of silk and money. They would drink their champagne and offer their hollow compliments. They would sit down to a meal of exquisite perfection, a testament to Amanda's impeccable taste. And as they ate the lamb, seasoned with my special salt, the polished plaster of their world would begin to chip, then crack, then crumble. I closed my eyes, the hum of the refrigerator a lullaby of impending ruin. The main course was ready. The night air in the pantry was thick with the ghosts of 1,000 meals, the scent of dried herbs and dusty spices, a familiar shroud. With the full layout of the banquet hall and the final menu in hand, I prepared my masterpiece. The target was the champagne vinaigrette for the main course salad, a dish every single guest would be served. It was a simple, elegant choice, one that would cleanse the palate before the main event, my herbed salt crust on the lamb. But the salad was the primer, the gentle, insidious warm-up act. My initial plan had been more direct, but Amanda's paranoia about my proximity to the main course had forced an elegant pivot. The vinaigrette was perfect. It was universal, unassuming, and its sharp, acidic profile would perfectly mask the subtle, bitter undertones of the powdered moonless root I had steeped in the champagne vinegar for a week. Moonless wasn't a truth-teller, not like the knobby root now sleeping on its twine. It was a loosener, a relaxant of the mental faculties. It wouldn't force a confession, but it would gently erode the walls of restraint, making the mind suggestible, pliable. It was the key that would unlock the door so the serum in the lamb could kick it down. The execution was a delicate ballet of calculated misfortune. The night before the event, during the caterer's final prep, I made my move. I took a small, nearly empty bottle of industrial-strength glass cleaner I'd pilfered from the supply closet. With the timing of a seasoned saboteur, I waited for the moment the head caterer, a perpetually flustered man named Marco, turned his back to lecture a sous chef on the precise brunoise of a shallot. I accidentally fumbled the bottle, sending a pungent chemical stream cascading across the stainless steel counter. A river of blue that swept menacingly toward the neat row of freshly prepared vinaigrette jugs. The gasp was almost comical. Marco spun around, his face a mask of horror. "Idiots! Asterisk, imbecile asterisk," he shrieked, his voice cracking. He snatched the contaminated jugs, holding them at arm's length, as if they were radioactive. "This is ruined. Absolutely ruined. We have no time to reduce. What could you possibly—" And, most importantly, me, safely occupied and out of the way, locked in my pantry with a mountain of menial labor. She could present my contribution as her own benevolence, a nod to the help she'd so graciously taken in. Her public image would be burnished, and her private contempt for me would be satisfied. "Fine," she snapped, the word a dismissal of both the crisis and me. "Do it, and make sure it's perfect." She didn't wait for a response. Sweeping away, her heels clicking a staccato rhythm of absolute authority on the polished concrete floor. The trap was now set. As the kitchen emptied, the late-night frenzy moving to the banquet hall for table setting, I retreated to my domain. The door clicked shut, and I allowed myself a single, slow breath. This was my stage. I assembled my components: the expensive champagne vinegar, the first-press olive oil that smelled of green grass and almonds, a whisper of Dijon mustard, a crush of garlic, and my special ingredient, the moonless-infused vinegar, dark and ominous, in its separate unlabeled bottle. The work was meditative. Whisking the emulsion, I felt like a alchemist. The golden stream of oil swirling into the pale vinegar was a confluence of destinies. When I added the moonless infusion, the mixture darkened just a shade, the color of old honey. I dipped a clean spoon, tasted it. The acidity was bright, the herbal notes perfect, but there was a faint, lingering echo on the tongue, a metallic whisper that promised unraveling. It was undetectable unless you were looking for it, and no one would be. I filled 3 large, sterile jugs, screwing the lids on with finality. They looked innocent, lined up on the counter. Just dressing, just a condiment. But within that oily, tangy matrix, a quiet revolution was brewing. Tomorrow, under the glittering chandeliers, as the socialites forked crisp greens into their mouths, the moonless would begin its work. It would soften their defenses, blur the sharp lines of their carefully curated personas. They would become receptive, their minds like fertile ground waiting for a seed. And then, the main course would arrive. The lamb, roasted with my salt and my twine, would deliver the final, undeniable truth. The moonless would have opened the gates. The knobby root would send the cavalry charging through. I ran a finger over the cool glass of a jug, a smile touching my lips. Amanda thought she had relegated me to making salad dressing. She had no idea she was letting me compose the overture to her symphony of ruin. The grand hall was a symphony of polished silver and crystal, a cavernous space where laughter echoed like falling chills, and the very air tasted of old money and new ambition. I had chosen my armor with care, a dress from my homeland, woven from deep indigo fabric and embroidered with intricate, swirling patterns in crimson and gold thread. It was heavy, substantial, the weight of generations in every fold. Amanda despised it, called it a costume, which was precisely why I wore it. I was not here to blend into the wallpaper. I was a statement, a specter from a past she was desperately trying to bury. I walked in not with the scurrying steps of a servant, but with the slow, measured pace of the matriarch. The sea of black ties and shimmering gowns seemed to part, not out of respect, but out of a vague, unsettled confusion. I saw Leo before he saw me. He was standing near the massive marble fireplace, a glass of whiskey clutched in his hand like a lifeline. His smile, aimed at some balding industrialist, was a brittle, fragile thing. When his eyes found me, that smile shattered. His face drained of its practiced charm, leaving behind a raw, panicked recognition. This was not the meek mother-in-law he could ignore. This was the woman who had kneaded the dough for his first birthday cake in our home, the one who had seen the boy he was before he became the man he pretended to be. Then came Amanda's gaze, a laser of pure venom cutting across the room. She was resplendent in a sheath of icy silver, her diamonds catching the light like shards of frozen malice. Her eyes, hard and glittering, swept over my dress, my posture, my uninvited presence, and I saw the calculations behind them, a scene, security. But I offered her only a serene, close-lipped smile. The kind you give a child who is about to learn a difficult, necessary lesson. I had not come to make a scene. I had come to witness one. I took my seat at a small, round table tucked near the swinging kitchen doors. A position of supposed obscurity that was, in reality, a perfect vantage point. From here, I could see the entire theater. The servers, crisp and efficient in their white jackets, began their ballet. They moved through the crowd bearing silver platters of salad, a vibrant mosaic of bitter frisi, peppery arugula, and tender butter lettuce. And on each leaf, glistening like liquid amber under the glittering chandeliers, was my dressing. I watched, my hands folded calmly in my lap, as the forks were raised, the first bites were taken. A murmur of approval rippled through the room. Divine dressing. I heard a woman in pearls exclaim to her companion. I allowed myself a small, private smile. Divine was not the word I would use. The change was not immediate, nor was it dramatic. It was a slow, subtle loosening, like a tightly coiled ribbon beginning to unfurl. The rigid, upright postures of the men began to soften. The sharp, competitive chatter of the women started to blur at the edges, the words coming slower, with more space between them. Laughter, once sharp and performative, became deeper, more genuine, and then, occasionally, a little too loud. The moonless was doing its work, a psychic solvent eating away at the varnish of their social propriety. I saw a renowned art critic, a man known for his brutal dismissals, pat the shoulder of a rival with a look of sudden, unguarded fondness. I watched a hedge fund manager's predatory gaze soften into a distant, almost childlike wonder as he stared at the intricate pattern on his plate. Leo and Amanda were at the center of it all, the doomed king and queen of this unraveling court. Leo was becoming agitated, his movements jerky, He kept running a finger inside his collar as if it were suddenly too tight. The moonless wouldn't hit him. With the full force of the truth, he hadn't eaten the salad, but its influence was a fog in the air. A general atmosphere of disinhibition that was making him profoundly uncomfortable. Amanda, ever the control freak, was trying to combat it, her voice becoming shriller, her commands to the staff more clipped. But she was fighting the tide. Then, the main course arrived. The platters of roast lamb were carried out, wreathed in aromatic steam. The air grew thick with the scent of rosemary and garlic, and beneath it, the undeniable, earthy truth of the nabi root from my garden. The flavor amplified and woven into the very fibers of the meat by my salt and my twine. This was the cavalry. I focused on my targets. I saw Amanda take a delicate bite, her face a mask of expected approval. The mask flickered. A tiny frown appeared between her perfectly sculpted brows. She chewed slowly, and I saw her throat work as she swallowed, not with pleasure, but with a dawning confusion. It was not a taste she could identify, only a deep, resonant familiarity that spoke to a part of her she had long since walled off. But it was Leo I watched most intently. He sawed into the meat with a force that was unnecessary, shoving a large piece into his mouth. For a moment, he was just a man eating his dinner. Then, he stopped chewing. His eyes, wide and suddenly lost, fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance. The flavors, the primal, honest earth of the root, the memory of meals shared at a humble table, the ghost of a life he had abandoned, were bypassing his intellect and speaking directly to his soul. The moonless had opened the gate, and now the truth was charging through. He dropped his fork. The clatter against the fine china was shockingly loud in the hushed room. All the color had left his face. He looked across the table at Amanda, but he wasn't really seeing her. He was seeing something else, something from long ago. Leo. Amanda's voice was a sharp whisper, a needle trying to pop a bubble. What is it? In his eyes, I saw it all. The shock, the confusion, and the first, terrifying fissure in the foundation of his denial. The confrontation I had engineered was about to begin, not with a shout, but with a fork. I watched Amanda at the head table, raising her glass for a toast, the crystal catching the light and scattering it like cheap glitter. I saw her take her first, deliberate bite of the salad. Her face a mask of smug satisfaction, a queen partaking of a tribute she believed was her due. The scene from a few days ago in the kitchen replayed in my mind. The sting of her words, the casual cruelty with which she'd dismissed a lifetime of my family's tradition as peasant food. But this time, the memory wasn't a shard of glass in my heart. It was the catalyst for everything that was about to happen. She saw my background as a simple, rustic failing, a secret she couldn't comprehend, a truth as deep and tangled as the roots of the moonless itself. I wasn't there as her victim, someone to be pitied and discarded. I was the silent judge, and court was now in session. My special pepper was about to do its work. The air in the grand dining room, usually thick with the scent of money and self-congratulation, had shifted. The moonless flowers, pulsing with their soft, silver light, seemed to breathe in time with the rising tension, casting long, wavering shadows that made the familiar opulent space feel like a dream more, perhaps the stage for a reckoning. I stood by the service door, a phantom in my server's blacks, my own heartbeat a drum in my ears, steady and sure. It began with Amanda. That first delicate bite, her face a mask of expected approval. The mask flickered. A tiny frown appeared between her perfectly sculpted brows, a crack in the porcelain facade. She chewed slowly, and I saw her throat work as she swallowed, not with pleasure, but with a dawning confusion. It was not a taste she could identify, only a deep, resonant familiarity that spoke to a part of her she had long since walled off, the ghost of a childhood before designer labels. A memory of a simple stew shared in a warm, cramped kitchen. Her eyes, for a fleeting second, lost their predatory sharpness and became lost. Searching the middle distance for an anchor, but it was Leo I watched most intently. He sawed into the meat with a force that was unnecessary, a performance of virility for his peers, shoving a large piece into his mouth. For a moment, he was just a man eating his dinner, a powerful figure secure in his domain. Then he stopped chewing, his jaw stilled, his eyes wide and suddenly lost, fixed on a point somewhere beyond the gilded wallpaper, beyond this room, beyond the last 20 years. The flavors, the primal, honest earth of the root, the memory of meals shared at a humble table. The ghost of a life he had abandoned were bypassing his intellect and speaking directly to his soul. The moonless had opened the gate, and now the truth was charging through. He dropped his fork. The clatter against the fine china was shockingly loud in the hushed room, a gunshot of reality. All the color had left his face, draining away to reveal the pale, startled man beneath the billionaire's tan. He looked across the table at Amanda, but he wasn't really seeing her. He was seeing something else, something from long ago. I knew what it was. He was seeing my mother's hands, rough and capable, kneading dough at our old wooden table. He was hearing the boisterous, unrefined laughter of his own brother, my father, a sound that had been absent from his life for 2 decades. Leo. Amanda's voice was a sharp whisper, a needle trying to pop a bubble of a memory she wasn't privy to. What is it? Her words were tight, a warning. This wasn't part of her script. He didn't answer her. His gaze, unmoored and desperate, swept the room. Over the faces of his important guests, their features now soft and strange in the moonless haze, a gallery of blurred masks. Their murmured conversations had died down, all attention subtly shifting to the head of the table, where the foundation was cracking. And finally, his wild, searching eyes landed on me. In his eyes, I saw it all, the shock, the raw confusion, and the first terrifying fissure in the granite of his denial. He wasn't looking at a server, he was looking at a ghost, a living, breathing reminder of the family he'd traded for this gilded cage. He saw my father's stubborn jaw, my mother's quiet, knowing eyes. The confrontation I had engineered was about to begin, not with a shout, but with a fork. A low murmur started to ripple through the guests, a current of unease. They shifted in their seats, sensing a shift in the atmosphere they couldn't name. The perfect, curated world Amanda had built was showing a hairline fracture. Leo's hand, which had dropped the fork, now gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles bone white. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. It was the silence that was the most damning. The great Leo Sterling, master of deals and oration, was rendered speechless by a flavor, by a memory, by a truth he had spent a fortune to bury. Amanda's confusion was curdling into something darker, something panicked and possessive. She placed a hand on his arm, her touch meant to anchor him back to her, back to this life. "Leo, darling, are you ill?" she asked, her voice louder now, trying to reclaim control of the narrative. But he shook her off, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but in that room it was as violent as a shove. His eyes were still locked on mine, and in that silent, charged space between us, across the sea of bewildered faces and the soft, accusing glow of the moonless, I saw the first glimmer of recognition, not just of who I was, but of what he had lost. The meal was over. The trial had begun. A low, guttural sound escaped Leo's throat, a strangled thing that was half gasp, half sob. It was drowned out by the rising tide of chaos, but I heard it. I was the only one who could. Amanda's slurred confession about her parents had been the first domino, and now the entire, meticulously arranged room was collapsing. "Who I haven't given a dime to, even though they're about to lose their house," she had said. Her face a perfect mask of bewildered horror as the words, the true, ugly words, fell from her painted lips. The nervous titter that followed was immediately severed by the voice of her own father, a man I'd seen beaming with pride just minutes before. He stood, his chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. "And while we're airing out the family laundry," he boomed, his voice unnaturally cheerful, "I've been sleeping with my secretary Brenda for 3 years. She's here tonight, actually. Wave, Brenda. She's much better in bed than my wife, and she doesn't nag me about my golf handicap. Pimienta, I presumed screamed, launching a bread roll at his head. And that was it. The dam broke. The pimienta, my little weapon of mass revelation, had seeped into every palate, every pretense. It was as if a truth bomb had detonated, shredding the delicate fabric of lies they all wore so comfortably. A powerful-looking man in a suit slammed his hand on the table, spitting at his business partner. You think I don't know you've been skimming from the Henderson account, you weasel? I've known for 6 months. I was just waiting for the right moment to bury you. It was a symphony of ruin, and I was the silent conductor. But my eyes never left Leo. He was an island in the storm, still frozen, his gaze a physical tether between us. The chaos around him was just noise. The real earthquake was happening inside him. Amanda was clutching at his arm again, her composure utterly gone. Leo, please, say something, she begged, her voice shrill. It's the food. It must be poisoned. Or we're all having a collective nervous breakdown. I built it on PowerPoint slides and my father's borrowed credibility. The patents are fake, the investors are dupes, and I'm so broke. I was going to use your capital to keep the charade going for just 1 more year. That's all I needed. I just stood my ground, a still point in the whirling madness, the humble server who had become the most powerful person in the room. I let him look. I let him see the resemblance he could no longer deny, the set of my shoulders that mirrored our father's. The subtle curve of my smile that was our mother's alone. Amanda followed his gaze, her confusion deepening. What is it? Why are you looking at the help? She was still trying to drag him back into her narrative, a narrative that was now in tatters at her feet. Leo slowly, deliberately, pried her fingers from his jacket. The gesture was gentle, but held a finality that was more devastating than a shout. He took a step away from her, towards me. The space between us, littered with the detritus of a ruined dinner party, seemed to shrink. The flavor, he murmured, his voice gaining a shred of strength. The asterisk, sofrito asterisk. My mother's how. The first truth had been served, and now it was time for the main course. The checkmate was watching the horrified look on Leo's face as he finally saw the real Amanda. The banquet, her grand stage for deception, had become a public confessional of her deepest, darkest truths. It was a thick, heavy thing, that truth, clinging to the expensive drapes and settling over the ruined feast like a shroud. The cloying scent of wasted wine and cold, congealing asterisk, sofrito asterisk was the perfume of her downfall. Amanda was on her knees now, a broken doll in a gown that cost more than a car, her sobs the only ragged soundtrack in the stunned silence. But my eyes weren't on her. They were locked with Leo's. He was still standing in the no man's land between us. His face a pale, shattered mask of confusion and dawning horror. He wasn't looking at the ruin of his wife, but at the architect of it, me, the humble server, the ghost. How, he repeated, his voice a raw scrape. The asterisk, sofrito asterisk. Only my mother knew. Those were the exact words from the stained, handwritten recipe card I'd kept tucked inside my mother's old Bible. The one he thought had been lost to time and a house fire. Who are you? He whispered. The question carrying the weight of a lifetime of suppressed questions. Amanda lunged, not at me, but at his legs, clutching the fine wool of his trousers. Leo, don't, she's lying. She's some jealous lunatic your father probably knocked up in a back alley. She's trying to destroy us. The name he'd built his empire on. The name he thought he was the sole heir to. That's impossible, he breathed. But there was no conviction left. The evidence was there, in the line of my jaw, in the gray of my eyes, a mirror of the father he'd buried. The resemblance he'd been trying to ignore all night was now an inescapable fact. Your father, I continued, my voice softening with a genuine, ancient sorrow, was a complicated man, a titan in the boardroom, but a coward in his heart. When your mother, my mother, got sick, he couldn't handle the decay. The scent of medicine overruled the perfume he loved. He found a newer, shinier model. I gestured vaguely at the space around us, at the opulence Amanda had curated. But before he left, before he took you and erased us, there was me. The firstborn. The one he left behind with a dying woman and a mountain of medical debt. He paid off the hospital, the funeral home. He gave us a new name, a small apartment in a forgotten part of the city, and a monthly stipend to ensure our silence. He bought our disappearance, but he couldn't buy my memory. Or my mother's recipes. It was a picture of a young woman with a radiant smile, holding a baby girl, while a small boy, a miniature Leo, peeked out from behind her skirts, his hand clutching her leg. I held it out to him. He took it as if it were a holy relic, his fingers trembling. He stared at the woman, our mother, at her face, so full of life and love. He stared at the little boy he used to be, a boy who had loved that woman with his whole heart. A single, silent tear traced a path through the fine stubble on his cheek. It was the first honest emotion I'd seen from him all night. Amanda, seeing his resolve dissolve, let out a wail of pure, undiluted panic. It's a fake. It's all a lie. I looked at my brother, truly looked at him, not as the powerful Leo Sterling, but as the little boy who had clung to me, his mother, after we lost everything. The main course had indeed been served. It was a bitter dish, full of betrayal and loss, but it was the only thing that could save him. And as I watched him remember, I knew the feast was only just beginning. The silence in the private dining room was no longer empty. It was full, thick with the ghosts he had just been forced to acknowledge. Leo didn't move, didn't speak. He just held the photograph, his thumb stroking the laminated surface over our mother's smile, as if he could feel the warmth of her skin. Amanda's wails had subsided into choked, ugly sobs, but they were just noise now, the frantic buzzing of a fly against a window pane. He was no longer in the room with her. He was in a sun-dappled kitchen that smelled of yeast and sugar, hiding behind the safety of our mother's skirts. I watched the tectonic plates of his identity shift behind his eyes. The Leo Sterling, the titan of industry, was receding, and in his place, the little boy, my brother. Liam was tentatively, painfully, rising from the ashes of a memory he'd been told was a lie. He finally looked up from the photograph, his gaze finding mine. The polished sheen of the powerful CEO was gone, stripped away, leaving behind something raw and unbearably young. Lena, he whispered, my real name, a fragile, broken thing on his lips. It was the first time he'd said it in over 20 years. It wasn't an accusation, it was a question, it was a plea. In the aftermath, Leo was devastated, but for the first time in years, he looked at me with clear eyes. He saw the strength his wife had tried so hard to mock. He saw the ghost of our mother in the set of my jaw, the stubborn hope in my gaze that had survived his bought and paid for oblivion. The waitstaff, professional to the last, had silently escorted a shrieking Amanda from the room. Her fate already sealed with the paperwork, waiting in a lawyer's briefcase downtown. The investors she had duped using Leo's name were already circling, their lawsuits sharp-toothed and hungry. Her life of lies was over. From my perspective, I didn't see a destroyed woman. I saw justice. I saw a truth that needed to be brought into the light. I had not destroyed her. She had simply been revealed, like a painting restored. The cheap, garish overpaint scrubbed away to show the rotten canvas beneath. My work, my years of planning, had not been about her destruction, but about his reconstruction. She was just collateral damage. Leo slowly, carefully, slipped the photograph into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, right over his heart. The gesture was so deliberate, so sacred, it felt like a vow. He told me you both died, he said, his voice hoarse. A car accident. He showed me a death certificate. He took me to 2 graves. Mom's grave was always just an empty plot. A prop in his play, the one you used to beg for, sneaking bits of the crispy fat when you thought she wasn't looking. A longing for something I'd lost. The only way in was through the one thing he could never control, the one thing he never understood, the legacy of our mother's hands. Her food. It was the only key that could fit the lock. It wasn't the voice of the corporate lion. It was the voice of a betrayed son. In his penthouse, I assume, I said, waiting for your call, waiting to hear how his son handled the unfortunate situation with the unstable chef. He's probably confident that his golden boy, the one he molded, took care of it. That you put me in my place. He stood up, the movement fluid and purposeful, the shock having solidified into resolve. He looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time I saw my brother, my ally. He was wrong, Leo stated, his voice flat and final. About everything. An anchor. The feast is only just beginning, you said, he murmured, repeating my words from earlier. A grim, determined smile touched his lips. A ghost of the mischievous boy from the photograph. Well, little sister, I think it's time we prepared the next course. And I have a feeling our father has just lost his seat at the table. He was something new, forged in the fire of a truth he should have always known. He was Liam Sterling again, and he was finally ready to come home. The scent of fresh paint and sizzling garlic filled my small apartment, a perfume of new beginnings. Weeks had passed since the night the Sterling Empire fractured, but the memory was as sharp and clear as the chef's knife in my hand. Leo, who now insisted I call him by his given name, was on his knees wrestling with the stubborn valve of a new commercial-grade gas range. He was helping me set up my new culinary business, a quiet determination having replaced his corporate demeanor. I still think you should have let me get you a proper space, he grunted, giving the wrench a final, decisive turn. A place in the financial district, somewhere with better parking for your clients. It was a fusion of my past and my future, a shrine to the food that had been my salvation. In the corner, on a small, carefully arranged shelf, sat the only two photos that mattered. One of my mother, her smile bright and unwavering, and one of my son Matteo, his eyes full of a piece I'd fought a lifetime to give him. La Cocina de Mama. Liam read the freshly painted script on the far wall, his voice softening. She'd be proud, you know? They didn't know the full story, of course. They didn't know about the ledger or the betrayal that ran deeper than business. They only knew that the food that night had been a revelation, and that the woman who cooked it now offered her services to a very select few. My phone buzzed on the counter a text from a tech CEO whose wife wanted a surprise anniversary dinner. They didn't just want a meal. They wanted the story. They wanted a taste of the simple food that had toppled a giant. They wanted to feel, for one evening, like they were part of something dangerous and true. I was no longer invisible. When I walked into a high-end grocer, I was no longer the help. I was a sought-after artisan. I held my head high, not because of the name I'd reclaimed, but because of the skill I had honed in the shadows. My dignity wasn't a gift given back to me. It was something I had seized from the ashes of my father's world. The buzzer from downstairs sounded. That'll be Matteo, I said, a smile instantly touching my lips. Liam moved to the intercom with a familiarity that still felt novel, a little miracle. Hey buddy, come on up. Can't have your mom's albondiga simmering on a weak flame, can we? It's tradition. He was still in his penthouse, I heard, still running his empire, but it was a hollowed-out kingdom. The real power, the enduring kind, was right here, in the steam rising from a pot of beans, and the sound of my brother's laughter. I looked at my son, his small hands covered in garlic peel, and then at my brother, his posture no longer rigid with corporate expectation, but relaxed, present. I had found my peace. It wasn't in the grand act of revenge, though that had been the catalyst. It was in this, in the respect I had commanded with my own two hands, in the family I had rebuilt from the wreckage. In the knowledge that the most powerful recipes aren't written in fancy cookbooks, but are passed down heart to heart from a mother who knows her own worth. And I, at long last, knew mine.